Hi, everyone. I'm Hamza, and I will be giving you a session today on international relations and South Asia. I'm just going to pull up my document, and we can get started. I think I might need screen sharing rights. There we go. Spoken in the nick of time. Amazing. Yeah, so I think before I start, just like a few housekeeping notes. If you want to ask a question, just pop it in the chat. And even if I'm in between sentences, just feel free to make yourself audible. I don't know if that's possible or how much of this session would be question and answer friendly, considering it's also to be recorded. So while I'm starting the session, I would really appreciate if someone from the ORCOM could just drop me a text and just say, yeah, we can do questions at the end. That's the most helpful, or we shouldn't do questions. Yeah, just please let me know if that's possible. Amazing. Okay, so I want to do the session on international relations because my feeling was that okay, so the general message is we can do questions at the end. So just save them up. So if we're doing questions at the end, I will make sure to end this in about 50 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, and then leave at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions, depending on the pace we go on. So yeah, like the reason I wanted to do a session on international relations was because my feeling was that there's an international relations that's debated at these tournaments, which is like, how much you know about a particular region or certain like sort of like canonical frameworks of national relations, like, realist understanding or liberal understandings. But my feeling was also that there's so many interesting things that you can get out from actual international relations. So what I'm going to do is try to cover topics in international relations that I found very helpful when I was debating, and then things which I don't think come up often in the context of like, coaching or sessions or even argumentation, unless you're someone who's sort of like well versed in international relations. And then towards the tail end of that, like I'll try to do the same thing for South Asia, try to discuss frameworks which are somewhat uncommon, but still, I think, hold a lot of resonance. That's just like something to keep in mind. I think the first thing I want to start with within international relations is this idea of two-level games. So two-level games inform a lot of international relations theory. And what two-level games at their most basic level say is that in order for us to understand international policy, we have to understand two levels of policy formation. And that those two levels are domestic negotiations and international negotiations. Now, this might seem trivial and obvious because, a lot of folks know that like two-level games are thing and, countries have to negotiate. But there's like some nuance here that I want to quickly go through because I think it would be kind of helpful. So the first thing that's important here is usually the policy that is made is part of a negotiation set drawn in correspondence with other states. So, let's say on the international negotiation stage, both states come up and they're like, well, state one says, I can do ABC. And state two says, well, I can do C, D, E. And then what usually happens is policy ends up being C because there's like some kind of overlap. What this analysis might miss is that states initially may start with a much broader negotiation set. So let's just say if you're the president or prime minister of a country, what you might initially start with is state one may have policy options ranging from A to H. And state two similarly might have policy options. I think someone's unmuted, ranging from B to K or something like that. What happens then is like domestic coalitions narrow the negotiation set you can actually take to the international stage. So this initial set that like, President Biden's advisors drew, or like, Rishi Sunak's like, team at 10 Downing Street do, is now narrowing because they have to deal with members of their own party, they have to deal with the opposition, they have to deal with the media. And soon enough, the range of possible options goes down to ABC only or CDE only. So there's a very limited amount of overlap. And the reason for this is that most policy internationally goes from domestic negotiation to international agreement to domestic ratification. So because in most cases, even in the context of like things like, executive orders and all of that stuff, they can be, for instance, challenged by other arms of the state. It's important that you consider the domestic, because even when you go back out to the international, you then have to come back and listen to the domestic. One interesting case study here is the case of authoritarian states. And authoritarian states also have a domestic mandate, and it comes in the form of two things. So the first thing it comes in the form of is what is called authoritarian minimums, which essentially means that like no matter how bad your dictatorship is, if your dictatorship gets bad to the point that people think it is better to die on the street fighting against you than living the life they're living, or it at least gets close enough to that, you have gone below your authoritarian minimum. So states which are dictatorial often have to satisfy these authoritarian minimums. Often what they look like are some version of like economic well-being being provided to these people, some form of social, if not political, liberties to ensure that the population isn't the happiest in the world, but they're definitely happy enough that they're not going to try to topple you. And then the second thing that authoritarian states have to satisfy are power coalitions. So, in every authoritarian state, essentially in the world, like with the possible exception of North Korea, when we just don't know enough about that state, there is no state in the world which doesn't have a power coalition underpinning it. So, for instance, in the context of Russia, it's not just the Russian Orthodox Church or the oligarchy, it's also members of the Russian army. Or if you look at someone like Prigozhin, who is the head of the biggest Russian paramilitary group, like these, all of these people feed into a big coalition, which become Vladimir Putin. So in every state, no matter who it is, you want to satisfy authoritarian minimums and you want to satisfy a power coalitions, business, industry, the military, religion, or whatever it might be. So all of these states, both authoritarian and democratic, have this underpinning called two-level games. It's like a helpful way to understand why some policy gets passed, some policy doesn't, why international negotiations fail. And it's just like one kind of like big picture thing to keep in mind. I think the second big thing that I want to talk about, which is again, as just like finding from international relations theory, is sanctions usually do not work. And I say usually because there are some exceptions to this that we will discuss in a second. But sanctions don't usually work for a few reasons. The first reason that sanctions don't work is sanctions disproportionately target the most economically vulnerable. So the reason, why is this true? So let's just say the United States decides we're gonna sanction Iran on its oil exports because we have a problem with it making like a nuclear program, something. If the United States decides to impose those energy sanctions, yeah, sure, like the people who are in charge of the companies get hurt, but like, we know how economies work. So we know that like the CEOs of these companies, the power elite, all of these people can displace the economic blame down to the average person. The way that would work is they would maybe divest the company or take a much larger share of bonuses to compensate for the sanctions while they're firing workers left, right, and center. So that's like a big reason why this happens, which is that powerful people have the capacity to displace the effect of sanctions. That's super, super critical to understanding why sanctions do or do not work. And then this kind of has like two different effects. The first effect that this might have is that, one second, I want to make, there we go. The first effect that this might have is it makes poor people in those target states much more friendly to anti-sender state narratives. So like, if you're a person who's like, living in Iraq like we 2003, or you're living in Iran these days, or you're living in Russia, and you wake up and you're like, okay, so the US government has sanctioned this and this in my country, and that means I can't put food on the table. It creates the seeds of anti-US sentiment, which often authoritarian states bounce upon. But the second thing does is it does nothing to influence the actual power brokers in these states. Now, what's interesting here is that sort of the bet that the US State Department or like any country is making in the context of these sanctions is they're like, even at its worst, if we can make the economy bad enough people come out against the state, then the state will buck the pressure. And that's fair. But sometimes what people miss is that the authoritarian minimum, as we were discussing, might be fairly low, right? Like, it might just be the case that you need to almost get people to the point where they're starving before they come out against a powerful autocratic state. But then there's this in between where people are suffering, where people do suffer economically, but they just don't suffer enough such that it influences state policy, and that's like a really unfortunate effect of sanctions. Another important reason to discuss why sanctions don't work is sanctions can often be displaced onto other states. Now, what do I mean by this? So what I mean by this is, let's say that the US decides that we're going to sanction some communist country, let's just say. And then that country is a small country. Let's think Cold War, right? Like it's a small country that the US is sanctioning. Now, what happens there is when the US says we're sanctioning them, it can say one of two things. So the first thing it can say is, we are sanctioning you in the sense that we are not going to buy any stuff from you and we're not going to sell you any stuff. The second thing that they can do, and this is like the more powerful sanction, is they can implement what are called secondary sanctions. So what secondary sanctions say is, not only are we not going to buy anything from you or sell anything to you, we're going to stop buying anything or selling anything from anyone else who's buying or selling with you. So, for instance, like, and this is a huge problem with the US Iran negotiation, where some set of the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed after it pulled out of the JCPOA with the Iran nuclear deal was that not only had heavy sanctions in place for Iran, it also had heavy secondary sanctions regimes in place, which basically meant that even the countries which agreed to the Iran nuclear deal, like a bunch of European countries, were in the difficult position of possibly being affected by US sanctions because they are choosing to trade with Iran. But even in those cases, what states can do is they can rely on what are called dark horse states. So let's say the US says, we're going to sanction North Korea for doing something. And then North Korea says, okay, we're in trouble. What do we do? Well, let's just buy and sell everything from China. And what that does is it diffuses the impact of the sanctions because you have a major trading partner who can compensate for that fall in trade. But then the second thing it does is the US is not going to impose probably secondary sanctions on China for trading with North Korea. But two, even if it does, like China is a much, much, much more powerful state, right? Like, so the US might face repercussions, or China might be able to absorb those sanctions into its massive economy. So that's another reason why sanctions don't work. That when you do try to impose them on people, just like in the rich versus poor example, states can rely on other states, which makes sanctions kind of problematic as a tool. There are other reasons as well. So I think another one is that sanctions most often work when they are backed by the legitimate threat of military force. And we can go over the several examples of where this was true. But essentially, what this argument says is that sanctions work not because of the sanction impact per se, but because of its evidence that the sender state is willing to go to great lengths to change behavior. So, in other words, sanctions work well almost only in cases where sanctions seem like 3 or 4 steps away from actual military conflict. In the same way that we treat it in debates, right? Like there's this sort of like implicit spectrum in debates, which is, the first thing that you do is diplomatic sanctions, and then you do economic sanctions, and then you like invade a country or something like that. Like that's sort of like what the intuition of this argument is, which is that when a target state receives the sanctions, they're not just worried about the literal immediate economic impact. What they're equally worried about is, wow, if the state is willing to do that, and they're saying that they're willing to use military force, we are now more willing to believe that they're willing to use military force if they've taken this drastic step of sanctions. So that's like another thing to keep in mind, which is sanctions sometimes work, but they kind of work in limited contexts. Another thing is that sanctions are often imposed keeping the well-being of the sender state in mind, making them diluted. Like let's think about this, right? So if you look at the Ukraine conflict, if the United States wanted to cripple the Russian economy tomorrow, it could do it. Like it's completely possible. But there's a real reason why, apart from some of the currency reserve stuff that they're doing with Russia, the sanctions have not been very effective. They are not effective almost by design, because the one big slice of the Russian economy that the United States is unwilling to completely sanction is its energy sector, because Russia remains as one of the world's largest energy suppliers, oil and gas. Now, if the US said, like, if you really want to cripple the Russian state, if you are like a US government official and that's your objective, like you would just immediately go after the energy sector. But there's like a reason you don't do it. Like the reason you don't do it is because there will be a global recession the next day. Like because the global economy is so intrinsically reliant on Russian oil and gas that if you launch the sanctions like tomorrow, by next week, probably in a couple of weeks, the price of oil would go up to $200 per barrel, which just numbers like it would be a lot more than it is right now. So that's another reason why sanctions are kind of hard, because sanctions are hurting both parties, right? Like when the United States imposed sanctions on the Soviet Union on grain exports in the 70s. The Soviet Union suffered damage in the millions of dollars, and the US ended up suffering in the tens of millions of dollars. So sanctions also become tricky from that perspective. So yeah, that was like lesson number 2, which is sanctions usually do not work. I think another thing that I want to discuss is the intuition of what's called prospect theory. Now, I don't know if folks have heard about this concept before, but I think it becomes like a very helpful framework from which to understand conflicts, especially conflicts which seem to be um, poorly designed and yet strangely still maintained. So, prospect theory says something very simple. All it says is that policies are made in the context of a domain of gains and a domain of losses. Um, Gains are things you can actively get in the world that you don't have by making a, or not making a policy. And then losses are, things you will lose that you do have by making or not making a policy. So the psychological literature on this is unanimous, which is people exhibit loss aversion, which is to say, they care a lot more about losing something they have than gaining something they don't. And you can look at examples of this within the context of like studying gambling, in the context of like, sort of like nominal lab experiments where you give someone $10 versus you take $10 away or take $5 away or something. But generally speaking, people don't want to lose what they have, definitely more than gaining something new. How does that engage with like some of the stuff that happens in from foreign policy? A lot of the stuff that happens in foreign policy. Before that, I do want to make one more caveat. When I say policies are made in the context of domain of gains and domain of losses, I don't just mean how they are framed. So it's not like an external thing where Bush is sitting in the White House with the White House Iraq group and they're like, should we frame this as gains? Should we frame this as losses? But more that it is genuinely the psychological background of policymakers. So I'm not just saying that like, this is used as a tool of justification. I'm saying that this is actively how people think. And it's like very hard to kind of like get out of that mindset. So keeping that in mind then, how does this interact with like examples? So let's think of Vietnam. If you start going through the literature and if you like, look at the speeches that LBJ gave, for instance, LBJ was for context, Kennedy's vice president. And then after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ became president. He was president for most of the time that Vietnam war escalation was happening. And if you look at his speeches, it's very clear that now that they're in Vietnam, they can't lose. Now, this is a very, very important way to understand the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War obviously initially might have started as like, a domain of gains. Maybe it started as a domain of losses, who knows? Like maybe the domain of gains would be setting up like another base for American influence in the Southeast Asia. Maybe the domain of losses would be here's a country which is doing really well and we're about to lose them to communism. Like, it could depend. But the one thing that's definitely true is that during the conflict, successive US administrations saw Vietnam from a domain of losses. It was something that they have that they will lose. And what that meant was this motivates much higher risk taking. And, this manifested itself in putting in military personnel and resources into a war that was almost bound to fail. And one can make the same argument for Iraq. One can make a similar argument for Afghanistan. And one can make a similar argument for a host of interventions that are taking place elsewhere. One could say that Putin has a similar calculus with Ukraine now that he is inside like certain parts of Ukraine, like the Donbass. So yeah, prospect theory just says Losses are things that you will lose, gains are things that you will get, and people are usually loss averse. And loss aversion can motivate people to take greater risks than in cases where they are making gains. Just like a thing to keep in mind. Um, let's do one more idea. I'm trying very hard to do ideas which like usually don't come up in debate. I think let one more thing I want to discuss is race dynamics. So a lot of conflict that we talk about in debate is often seen to be fueled is often seen from the perspective of a competition or a race. And the intuition here is state X initiates some kind of buildup, which motivates state Y to also initiate a buildup, which feeds back into state X's actions. And there is now a negative feedback loop. And part of this also is the framing of what international relations scholars call the security dilemma, which is in the absence of knowing, like, let's say I'm a country, let's say like it's like, the kingdom of Hamza or something. And then I'm really unfriendly to Pakistan for some reason. And the Pakistani government, who I'm in some sort of like adversarial relationship with, decides that they're going to start building 100,000 new ballistic missiles, right? And now when they're doing that, like, they've released this like beautiful speech by the prime minister, which says like, look, we're only doing this to as like, to build up our armaments for international peace. We're part of this is also part of an infrastructure bill where we're trying to employ people. Part of this is also modernizing our military, which we should have done like 40 years ago. But, I'm sitting there in the kingdom and I'm thinking, I can't be sure why they're doing this. So I'm gonna start doing it also because I don't know if I can take them at their word. So the security dilemma is often built on misperceptions and perceptions, and on also what are called informational asymmetries. For those who are unfamiliar with this term, it just means different sides know different levels of things about each other. So let's just say I haven't found out in a news article that they're making 100,000 ballistic missiles. Let's say that there have been reports, but you're not sure, or the reports say that they are doing a ballistic missile buildup. I don't know how many, I don't know across how many years. And all of these things feed into this security dilemma, which tends towards suspicion of other states. The lesson I want to deliver here is often you are not in a race dynamic, even when others think so. And I want to talk about like a few examples here, which I think could be interesting for you guys to think about, and then maybe even discuss in questions and answers. So if you think of the race for nuclear weapons, the general intuition behind the race for nuclear weapons was, Leo Szilard comes up with a bunch of equations and then he's chatting with Einstein and they're like, let's not talk about these equations. This is like in the early 30s because they might be used to build a bomb. And then there is fear that the Nazi regime is building nuclear bombs, which is somewhat true. Like, Heisenberg's like doing different things with nuclear stuff. But what's interesting is that by 1942, this is like 3 years away from the United States having the bomb. It is reasonably clear that the Nazis, even if they were building a bomb, have abandoned all of those projects. They don't have enough scientists to do it. Most of them have fled Germany. They don't have the resources, and they are stretched so thin on the military front in across Europe. So the Nazis have now stopped building the nukes. But because this is not widely known within the United States, and two, the government is pushing the narrative that the Nazis are still either right behind us, catching up to us, or right in front of us. People keep building the bomb, keep building the bomb, keep building the bomb. And then, like, quite apart from the few 100,000 people that died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the use of the nuclear bomb motivated other states to make it, right? So, like, just a few years after the Soviet Union had nuclear bomb, the United Kingdom had the nuclear bomb. A few years after that, like India and Pakistan had it. And one imagines that if the United States had chosen to abandon its nuclear program, the world would probably be a much safer place, at least in the narrow context of nuclear risk. One can think of the same thing for the race for B-52 bombers. These are the things that you need to bomb at the time in the 50s and the 60s to sort of like drop any kind of bomb. Like it could be like a nuke, it could be a different kind of missile. Like you need like a B-52 bomber. And again, intelligence comes in the United States and it says the Soviets are building B-52s. And then they're like, okay, we need to build some. And then the United States ends up building like what, 6,000 B-52 bombers? And the Soviet Union has, even if it was building them, 27, and only 4 of them can reach the United States. And now suddenly that spurt leads to other countries investing in them, bumping up security risk. Everyone's building weapons. It's also true for the race for bioweapons. I don't want to get into this one in too much detail because it will take time. It might be true for the race for artificial intelligence. Like there is a general assumption in international relations that there are 2 states in the world which will achieve what's called transformative artificial intelligence, which is to say AI that will radically change the world in some way. And that could be like catastrophic, like, a bunch of people die. It could be in a power sense, the country which has it will like, change the world forever, whatever. But like everyone has kind of gotten on board with the fact that something will happen in the next probably 1 decade to the next couple of decades where AI is going to be transformative. And this is why ownership matters a lot. And another point of consensus amongst those who look at this is that the 2 countries closest to achieving what could be called transformative artificial intelligence are China and the US. And if you look at some of the feedback and speeches given by US policy officials, I find them very similar to the nuclear weapons and B-52 bombers and bioweapons example, where we are in a direct race with China. Everything that we care about in the 21st century is on the line. We need to rapidly develop artificial intelligence. And some of the Chinese state people are doing something similar. But in the US government context, it's very interesting because the companies are doing it, the think tanks are doing it, the government is doing it. But if you actually kind of start looking into it, like for things to do with China no longer having as many chips as it did before because of the bill that Biden passed last year, the complete lack of its high impact AI research, the fact that most Chinese PhD students just come to the US, and like a bunch of different reasons, like it would be hard, really hard to make the argument that China is close to the United States in AI. But the fear here is that if the US rapidly tries to develop this technology, which could be dangerous because it's thinking we're in a race with China, just like it did with nukes, just like it did with B-52 bombers, just like it did with bioweapons, arguably the stakes in AI are yet higher, then we will once more be in relationship with a new technology which could potentially hurt a lot of us, which has been poorly understood and perhaps poorly designed because we were so eager to beat China. And that I think is another problem with the race dynamic that just makes security thinking worse. These are like 4 ideas that I'm pretty sure I've not seen come up a lot in debate. So I'm going to stick with those. I'm going to briefly pause here and take a couple of questions on some of this stuff before starting to talk about South Asia. I think that would be a helpful way to do it. Is the ORCOM happy with that? I think so. Let's assume they're happy with that. So can you please move up the dock a little? Yeah, of course. There we go. In fact, I can zoom out so that you can see a little bit more. And okay, if you missed the first 30 minutes, you might want to go back on the recording because there's like folks who are trying to track the document, but um 1 second. And I can also send it to you, of course. Okay, so now we're getting questions. I hope everyone can see these on the chat. Also, if folks want to make themselves audible and ask them, that's also fine. But just going through the questions on the chat for a second. One of the most used responses to sanctions are bad argument is always, if not sanctions, what else? If they don't work, do we have alternatives to alter bad behavior? Yeah, I mean, we do. I don't think the problem with, I mean, there's like a lot to unpack there. So the first thing to say there is an argument that sanctions can be ineffective is not necessarily a wholesale argument against sanctions. So it's not to say we should never sanction people. Like there are many cases there sanctions might be helpful. Like, and not just the example I gave where you're backing it up with military force. I don't know how much you've looked into this, but some of what the United States is doing with shutting off currency reserves for Russia has been an incredibly effective sanctioning tool, whereas the general economic sanctions haven't been. So the first is just like, it kind of depends on what sanctions. So the attempt here was not to put places in a debate dichotomy of bad versus good so much as here are several qualifications about sanctions. But even sort of like assuming, let's assume that's true, that like sanctions are bad in a bunch of cases and you're in the place in the debate where you're supposed to argue against them. I think you can, like there are like 3 or 4 ways to do it, which you might be aware of. I just think people don't think that they're intuitive, even though I think they can be argued for fairly well. I mean, and also like, like we're having a very general discussion on sanctions. So a lot of this will vary from context to context, depending on which region we're talking about. I mean, but like for one thing, states really care about diplomatic sanctions. I really think that like debate people just like completely ignore this. Like, and what does diplomatic sanctions mean? If you pull out, if you're a small authoritarian government and the US pulls out their ambassador from your country, like this certainly means you don't have a communication channel with what might be your potentially biggest trading partner. Again, you're not getting sanctioned, but how are you on earth are you supposed to negotiate the next big thing? Or another example might be, let's kick them out of international organizations. And a lot of authoritarian states, for reasons of prestige and self-perception and brinkmanship, do care. Like China really cared that it was at the chair of the United Nations Human Rights Council, for instance. So getting these states out of those things is super, super powerful. So I think that would be one. I think the second thing would be trying to create legitimate forms of resistance within those countries, which aren't based on economic sanctions, right? So, like, for instance, in my opinion, like US aid through its development projects and the money it's provided to vulnerable communities has done a lot more damage to authoritarian governance than, like CIA coups and things like that, right? So you could provide legitimate forms of aid and assistance to those who are standing up in resistance to this government instead of sanctioning them directly. So those are like some of the ways that come in mind. There's probably a bunch more, which would depend specifically on the context, which I'm happy to go into if you have a clarifying question there. But yeah, like I think the issue here isn't they're like sanctions don't work and you're like, oh, what do I do? It's like other ways exist. It's just that sometimes folks think that they're not very intuitive. So I think that's an important one. And also I got the same question 2 minutes later. What's the alternative to sanctions if you have to contain authoritarian states? So apart from those two that I've mentioned, I think also like there is just simply like diplomatic sanctions from other states. So let's just say you're talking about Mali or some country in like the Sahel region or something. And like one way to do it is to sanction them by yourself, but another way to do it is to get other states to do it. So I don't know if you saw the African Union proceedings these last few months, but 4 states not being allowed to have membership really affects their diplomatic and economic chances. So it's not just like a third layer of this analysis would not just be diplomatic sanctions directly, but also ensuring that other states to whom this relationship is valuable also end up punishing this kind of authoritarian state. And I think part of the answer is also like there's this weird sense of like running towards the finish line in these arguments of like, well, we can do economic sanctions tomorrow, but if you want to set up democratic resistance there, will you let people suffer for 50 years? Yeah, I guess, because like, like it's better than trying to cripple an economy and leading it, like pushing it to being a failed state. Like, part of the understanding you guys also have to change is like if the game is what is the most urgent thing we can do to hurt a government to push change, then yeah, you have very few options. But I just don't know why you're accepting that trade-off, right? Like I think it's a completely legitimate foreign policy tool to push democratic resistance, to push progressive movements, even if that's a battle that is generational. Because you know what, like when situations are tough, it takes a while to change, right? Like you can't, instead of like relying on sanctions as some sense of like a silver bullet. Um, and then I hope that answers your question. And then there's another one. Do you possibly have examples of the successful sanctions that have succeeded to the exact reason you provided, which is that they are backed up by the legitimate threat of force? Yeah, I think I can. I think there's like a few examples like they're out there. I mean, the biggest one would be Iraq, right? Like if you go back to 2002, you like the Iraqi government is like essentially pleading, we don't have WMD, we stop making them, stop doing this kind of thing. Because like, these sanctions are coming in on the back of what everyone now knows might be a legitimate military intervention into this country. And I think that's really important. I think um another one would probably be something like, what is it? It's a Latin American country that the US keeps intervening in. But I think I think it might be there's so much stuff to keep in your head. Um mm, Guatemala, I think, because there was this huge thing happening about human rights sanctions in the 1980s and the Guatemalan dictator, and then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission being set up and all of that stuff. And part of the reason those sanctions were working was because, they knew that like if they don't, if they're sanctioning to this extent, they wouldn't mind like going in with folks. I think that's like another one. There's probably like a whole list out there actually. Like I don't have to pull these from memory and waste everyone's time. I can just send you that paper and like you can kind of go through it and sort of scrutinize it yourself. Yeah, can you please give us the link of this doc file? Yeah, of course, I'll send it to the organizer and then I'm sure they can share it with you. What are some good sources to read up about these concepts and related ones, or just generally to track important international events or op-ed articles on? Oh, wow. Like this to me is like a silver bullet question, which is essentially saying, how do I find out everything about IR? I don't think, even if there is an answer to that, and I haven't seen it, I think the premise of the question is not helpful. Like you just have to read a lot, dude. Like you have to like like I can suggest some books on IR where I'm like, this is a good book for IR theory. This is like, but I think especially like I've noticed this like growing up in the Pakistani debate circuit as well. Like there's this tendency to be like, how do I absorb the exact information I need in order to win the debate? And one, like I would just be like, there's value to this knowledge which doesn't apply to just debate, right? Like, debate should motivate you to learn more about the world for things to do past debate. I know that sounds idealistic, but it's like a huge concern I have with debate. And then the second thing is it's almost like a chat GPT thing of like, just tell me the exact thing to read so I can apply it to the debate. And what gets lost in translation is the process of deep reading, the process of um analyzing, critical analysis, all of that stuff, synthesization, like, all of those things that your head does when you read 10 different things as opposed to read like the distilled notes. Like the only person who should read the distilled notes is like the president of the United States because he has 6 minutes to read a briefing before meeting Xi Jinping. Like you guys have time. I would suggest that you read a lot of books. And if you want books on specific things, I can send them to you. Having said all of that, like, okay, well, if you want to read books, just Google Handbook for International Relations or Great International Relations book. Like Andrew Haywood has a good one that I think you would quite enjoy. And tracking international events and op-eds, dude, just read a lot of newspapers. Like I think I don't know if this is like an effect of our like collective education system, but like we are sometimes like shy of like um educational uncertainty. Like the best way to learn is not knowing where to go and then just like reading a bunch of different things. Like, do that Wikipedia spiral, just Google News something and be like, what's happening about this today? Because I'm just curious. And that random, messy process eventually leads to you like knowing a lot. I think that would be my feeling. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be like push back on the question too much, but I do feel like the silver bullet theory of debate improvement, I think really helps. So I would recommend doing those things. If you still really, really, really want me to give you like the best newspapers to read or like some kind of like picker for events, like I can send it to you, but that would be my general feeling. Um, Okay, Imran has an extensive question. Imran, can you message again in the chat and tell me if it's below 60 seconds because I'm also mindful of like answering others' questions. Um, is there a perspective of race dynamic being good, like the space race driving? So this question is like, can race dynamics be helpful? Oh, of course. I mean, race dynamics can be helpful even in the case of like bioweapons, right? Because bioweapons, I don't know how much you know about this, but biotechnology is like dual use, right? So what that just means is you can use it to make a vaccine, but you can also use it to make a virus. That's also true for AI, right? Like the race developments being driven in AI are going to provide economic bounties to the states which participate in them. That doesn't mean that it's good in every way, I think is sort of the point, which is like, we got like, because it misses the counterfactual, because what it's saying is, well, if we hadn't put so much money into the nuke, we may not have gotten the GPS. And you're like, maybe we could have just gotten the GPS in the microwave without getting any of that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I think like, like these arguments on, well, it allowed, and also like, I think you're sort of like subtly assuming um, that nuclear weapons being given to states like India and Pakistan create some form of deterrence. Again, misses the counterfactual. Like, what does deterrence look like in a world where no one has nuclear weapons, right? Like, how do our institutional agreements change for the last 50 years? So I think I'm not saying that none of that is true. There are benefits to all races. There's probably some form of deterrence from high impact weapons like nuclear weapons and bioweapons. But I think sometimes these arguments miss a comparative imagination of what would the world look like otherwise if there was truly nothing else. Yes, I will share a link to the doc. Um, how exactly does the prospect theory affect countries' decisions to intervene militarily in conflicts? Oh, like in all the ways, right? Like, if you look at prospect theory, and prospect theory just says to you, if you so the starting premise is invading other countries is risky. I think everyone should probably agree with that, right? Like, but like a covert thing is probably less risky, an overt thing is probably more risky. Helping a government is probably less risky. Trying to take down a government is probably more risky, but it's all risky. If you are country X trying to invade country Y, it's risky. And I think what loss aversion says and prospect theory says is if you are perceiving intervention in this case as a domain of losses, then you are much more likely to intervene than from a domain of gains. So for instance, if you think of the United States having a really good ally like South Korea, and then North Korea decides we're going to go down from the 38th parallel and we're going to invade South Korea for some reason. The US, in my mind, is much more likely to take incredibly drastic decisions to protect South Korea because it perceives the loss of this strategic partner from a domain of losses than from a domain of gains. Versus new economic territory opens up. Let's just say that, like, the 30s, 40s, and 50s happen again, that some country in Latin America is now booming economically, and the United States wants the bounties of its economic benefits. But in order for us to do that, like we would have to like intervene in that country and do different things. The bar for that would be different. So it really depends on whether it's a loss or a gain really affects that kind of decision. Could you please link the list to this doc? It won't be a literal list. It'll probably be a paper which mentions lots of examples, but I'm super happy to do that. How do you defend sanctions, economic warfare by the West against belligerent states? It's undefendable, or do you pivot? Why is it? There's so much in that. Like, why do you think that's why do you think that's undefendable? Like, if like can you in like 15 seconds make yourself audible if that's comfortable, Krishant? Like because I'm just thinking like if Russia invades an innocent country, like I can think of lots of good reasons why they should sanction Russia. Like, is there a counter argument I'm missing here?
Yeah, the only question that I had with regards to that was that, look, if efficacy is something that isn't a super strong argument, especially against more authoritarian states, that these sanctions will work or will actually provide deterrence and stuff like that, then what kind of arguments do you pivot to justify these sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, as I said, there are many cases where sanctions might work. Like, for instance, the currency reserve targets on Russia. So, like, it's not a binary between sanctions working or not working so much as we often think sanctions work. Here are a lot of reasons why sanctions may not work. But do like like the benefit of sanctioning a state is to signal to that state that you will suffer punishment if you violate certain moral and legal precepts. A second reason might be to demonstrate a clear sense of support to the state which has its rights being violated at that point. In this specific example, Ukraine. The third is to inflict at least some minimal damage, which, in tandem with diplomatic sanctions, Ukraine's military excursions, can all together work and affect Russia, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be like, why aren't economic sanctions doing everything? And if they're not doing everything, why are we using them? Like, it all works in tandem. So even if economic sanctions work 20% as opposed to like 90% or 100%, that still goes a long way towards fitting into the broader picture of change. So that's like three reasons. I hope those are sufficient. Will the recording of this lecture be accessible? You have to ask the ORCOM. I'm sorry, I don't know this. The power an actor holds matters when it comes to sanctions, right? So vast majority of sanctions are likely imposed by countries like the US. If that is true, what would be ways developing nations then engage with such hegemons or bullies or deal with conflicts they are very of their own? It depends, right? Like, like just because of the dollar, like the United States has a power that is truly unprecedented. But I would push back that, like, those like countries can't, because the economy is not a monolith, right? So the economy has several different facets which create several different interdependencies between countries. So for instance, you might have a small country, say Qatar or Saudi Arabia, or even like Iran or something like that. And if they decide that they're going to cut off the their oil and natural gas supply to another country, even though they're not very powerful on the international stage themselves, they have almost crippled that country's economy, right? So like, but they're not as powerful, let's say, in the financial sector or anything like that. It's the same thing with something like Singapore, or you could take a developing nation state, even smaller still. So you could talk about sub-Saharan and Northern Africa, where if some states decide to shut off water supply to states going further southwards, you have just single-handedly taken this country out. So there's a lot of power that developing states have depending on the nature of the resource being talked about and the closeness of the relationship. If the relationship is sufficiently close between one weak country and another, and it is reliant on a resource that the state has a comparative advantage in, they can do lots of things. And the second answer is they rely on bigger states, right? Like they rely on the United States and China or France or the United Kingdom, depending on what side of the conflict they're on, in order to push their position on the great power stage. Um, and then uh, okay, so Imran's asking, I wanted to ask about specific motions where the motion states small country prioritizes relationship towards superpower actors. This house believes that the EU should further prioritize relations with China. Okay, dude, you'll have to actually, I think you will have to make yourself audible. I don't get this.
So my question was basically like, how do you approach the motion in terms of what is the benefit of going to X super actor as opposed to Y super actor? Because usually most of what I've heard about China is bad loan trap deals. So like, why would a country have an incentive to go for countries aside from the US, which are established to already be bastions of democracy, etc.?
Yeah, I think there's actually like a stronger argument in some cases to go to China, which is like more obvious in the United States. Like if you, for instance, think of countries which want cheap money. Cheap money in this case just simply means these countries cheap money in this case means you're going to get money without a lot of strings attached. Like with the US, there's often like these due diligence things and different things, and then they often tack on human rights concerns or whatever. With China, like you can just get lots of cheap money for little to no conditions. That's like a very big reason why states should prioritize relationship with a state like China over states like the EU and the United States. The second reason is just that, like, like China is likely to be a legitimate superpower, and being proximate to it might give you advantages, right? So for, and especially when you're geographically proximate or economically proximate, like, if you're a country like, what's a good example? Kazakhstan, having a relationship with China is arguably as important or more important than having a relationship with the US. A third reason would be that it allows for an offset. So if you prioritize relationships with, if you're a country which has historically had pro-US and EU relations, and you start pivoting towards China, even the relationship that is left with the US and EU, the negotiating power that you have there really increases. So that's like another reason to shift priority scales. Like, the non-aligned movement countries have done this all the time. I hope that sort of gives reasons for why states choose to do this. On the motion, this House believes that the UN should intervene in Sudan. Like, try to send messages which are like to the group if you can, unless it's a privacy concern, because I just want to make sure everyone can read the questions everyone's sending. This House believes that the UN should intervene in Sudan on behalf of the civilian government. Is it possible for opposition to run the African Union instead as a trap card? Dude, I love these debating terms. I have no idea what a trap card is. Can you make yourself audible and tell me about this, or do you want to send like a further message? This sounds like Yu-Gi-Oh or like Pokemon now. Okay. Next question. How is the warm water policy affecting modern geopolitics in oil wars? I think you have to elaborate this question a bit more, perhaps starting with the definition of the warm water policy, and then we can go through it. Because I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure what you mean. So I would need some clarification on that. How could you explain Putin's incentives for Ukraine through prospect theory? I'm not very knowledgeable about it, but the invasion doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, like, it's actually very easy to make that argument, right? Like, you're a guy who's a KGB agent in the 80s. You watch perhaps the most humiliating defeat in the history of the Russian Empire happen. Russian GDP falls 50% between 1991 and 1996, which is more than it fell during World War II. You then watch your country being embarrassed on the international stage over and over as your people suffer. And one of the biggest embarrassments there is that countries which were part of the Russian Empire, with the so-called post-Soviet states, are now independent states of their own, in fact, actively agitating against their ancestor controllers. So, like, I think it's very easy to make the argument that, like, for Putin, Ukraine is a domain of losses, because it was a loss that was incurred by the Russian Empire, which needs to be now reversed. And I think that's how I would make the argument. Maybe prospect theory is a less relevant framework there, but I do think it's very easy to make a strong case for why that's driving a lot of Putin's behavior. Why, or also like Orcom, at some point you have to like hold me to account with time, because I'm just like running through lots of questions which are about random things, and I don't know when you're all supposed to like stop. Okay, so why or how important is international backlash to a semi-authoritarian country in the two-level games, given that other states are also deterred by their own interests? How much does an authoritarian then care if they can uphold the minimum that is? I mean, I don't know if there's a formula. Like I can't give you a number or a percentage. Where I can go through are like, relevant factors like um international backlash matters to authoritarian countries because, and this will like be like a strange thing to say, they just care, right? Like if I don't know if you all have like engaged with people on the international stage a lot, but like if you talk to the ministries of international of countries across the world, authoritarian states, if you look at some of their like embassies and stuff, like they always have a copy of The Economist or something like on their ambassador's desk or something, right? Like these are people who care about international opinion because they care about international opinion. Because remember, like the vast majority of them are Western educated and definitely Western influenced, even if they don't exhibit it um, externally, right? So that's one big reason why international backlash matters to them a lot. The second is just prestige. Even if their public doesn't care, I think they just care. And if they can uphold the minimum, then yeah, like maybe it's harder to change their behavior, but like the minimum can change, right? Like, so the minimum doesn't just have to be economic, the minimum can also be social, right? It might just be the case that if you're a person from country X where your state has done some horrible things, your minimum isn't just can I put food on the table? It's that why does everyone in the world hate us? And why are we such a source of international embarrassment? And why am I like, why is being from this country something I have to live down, not live up to? So I think the backlash can intersect in lots of interesting ways. I hope I got your question there. 5 minutes till close. So while government might expect opposition to run non-opposition intervention, but opposition runs that the African Union. Dude, I think that's a question of debating technicality. I don't know if I'm best placed to answer it because I haven't been in the circuit for a while. My intuition would be you should take the spirit of the motion and argue against intervention. But like, there's a reason it's called a trap card, right? Like it's called that because it's somewhat insidious and deceptive. Like I would just argue against intervention. Maybe there's people who see it differently in the specific circuit that you're in, but that would be like my general advice. Um, okay, another question. Guys, again, send these to the group so everyone can see them. Otherwise, people are like, what am I talking about? Okay, so Wilbin saying, unsure if this was touched upon earlier, but is it likely for a war between China and Taiwan to break out? Dude, I'm here on a debate session. I have no, I think it's irresponsible for me to comment on this. I can give you my personal opinion as like a 27-year-old who reads about these things and talks to people being in DC, but I can't, my first answer is I don't know. My second answer on the Taiwan China thing is I do know that people here are very worried. Like I've talked to some people in the United States government who are really worried that this summer in particular and potentially the end of the year is going to be a time when things might get very tricky with Taiwan. So people are legitimately worried. It's not just speculation. People are like they are military exercises happening as we speak. Like there's a real legitimate concern that China might attempt to expand its influence into Taiwan in ways that might be unprecedented. But I think that's all I know for now. Um, a common response I've seen to the analysis you give on Putin's decision making is just say, if Team X can figure that out in 15 to 25 minutes of prep, Putin can probably detect it as well and follow it up with some systems-based analysis where leaders are cold, calculating figures who only look to maximize certain parameters. Putin only seeking to like, I mean, this actually that makes it sound like no, but it's the entire point of a psychological bias is that it's hard to detect it. Like it's not measured as a scope of time, right? Like like the evidence on prospect theory or prospect framing, loss aversion framing, which we all have, is undeniable in Vietnam. And you had the world's biggest military infrastructure thinking about that war for like 20 years, right? Like if I have met people who have like PhDs from Harvard who are going into like a casino trying to gamble their savings away. Like they like people know in a sense, right? Like, it's like I think the response that if X team can figure out 15 minutes, why doesn't Putin know is glib and it misses how psychological biases work. Psychological biases and cognitive devices and the environment that you're in, it creates the trappings of what you think and what you can do, right? Like it's just I think this overemphasis on what I would probably call rational decision making, which is like at any given point, most leaders are only doing things which maximize what benefits would accrue to them, is almost never true. Like there will always be some emotional or psychological or cognitive explanation for why states are doing things which don't seem to be in their self-interest. And also, like, just the facts, like Putin, like there's I'm watching my friends, like, videos, like there's people dying on the streets in Moscow and St. Petersburg right now trying to oppose the regime. And there's like if you, I don't know if you watched Prigozhin speak last week, but like the oligarchy isn't super happy with him either. So if that's his like end interest, the facts definitely don't seem to match up to it. Um, um, yes. So for friends, to everyone who's asking, like this document will be available vis-a-vis the organizer. Um, yeah. Is there like I'm sorry I sort of like skipped South Asia. There were like so many interesting questions because I feel like with IR you should just do like a 2 hour thing where people just ask questions and we talk about them. Do you want to do like the last couple of questions? If anyone has any last few left, just like pop them in. I'll try to stay for like 10, 20 if that's fine with the organizers. And then kind of head out. Because I want to get as many as I can. Um, anything else? Anyone?
Hello,
Hello.
can I ask so
Go on. Go on.
On the Ukraine war, there was
Yeah,
this
yeah.
one motion. I kind of sent it, but shortly it's about the counter-offensive. So there
Oh, I
was
see
an
it. Yeah, yeah.
there was an op argument that said NATO will retract their support because Ukraine's image would be tarnished. And that got me thinking, what is like the perception on Ukraine? Does the international community support Ukraine regardless of the counter-offensive? Like what does Ukraine state have state within the international community that NATO continuously gives its support, etc.?
But I still I don't get the premise of our question. Like, so is it that they're only supporting Ukraine because it might successfully repel Russian incursions? Is that what you're saying?
The argument that was run was that the Ukrainians are like this, they have this image that NATO wants to keep it, and the counteroffensive will destroy that image. So NATO will retract their support. Because they are defenders in a war, and the counteroffensive would make them seem as the offenders of the war, which was
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Yeah, but I mean, for one thing, like with the exception of like a few mass missiles landing on Russian territory, like the counter offensive here, like there is no, for instance, like there's no such thing as a counter defensive, right? So when you say counter offensive and you're expanding eastwards towards cities like Lviv and then going further eastwards and going to the Donetsk and Luhansk and like your counteroffensive is a recapture of your own territory, right? Like so recapturing Bakhmut after the Wagner group took it like a few months ago is part of the counteroffensive. So I think this like motion kind of misses like what a counteroffensive is. Like a counteroffensive is moving forward. That's what a counteroffensive is. And the vast majority of that will include just capturing territory that Russia captured from like March 2014 onwards. The second thing is, even if that like leads to like incursions into Russian territory, I don't think the NATO allies have a problem with it. From what I've seen, like I think the only thing the US government has said is if you're using US missiles, like missile with American flag on them, don't use them in Russian territory. You can use them however you want within the confines of your own territory. So and I think secondly also, like I think that the reason the US and NATO are saying that is not because they're like pro-Russia, it's because they don't want to risk nuclear conflict. So I would be astonished that no matter how this offensive goes, whether it's in Russia, in Ukraine, successful, not successful, that NATO allies start pulling out. I think the only fear with the counteroffensive, and this is why I'm really hoping it does go well, is it seems like some of the noises being made in the Western governments is towards a negotiated settlement. And the Ukrainians don't want that, right? Like they don't want someone to come and invade half their country and then negotiate that half of it to them just to keep the other half. So I feel like for the real thing on the line for the Ukrainians is to take back as much as they physically can in the counteroffensive. If anything, it's almost a flip of your point, to be as aggressive as possible, because what you capture in this effort will really decide the future of the negotiated settlement, I think. I hope that was helpful. How do you get better at applying IR concepts into debate? I find this similar with other matter-heavy themes like econ, that every day, even after knowing concepts behind them, it's hard for me to find case directions with specific motions. I think this is why I was like pushing back on. I think it might have been Arian. I'm not wrong if I'm not wrong, but this is why I am really resistant to learning things for the sake of debate, because you should you should be learning them to apply them to all kinds of situations and contexts. Like if you take like prospect theory, like really sit down and go through the exercise of where could this apply? Or if you think of race dynamics, the same thing. Like, like there's two-level games. Like two-level games, for instance, don't just apply to countries. Just start thinking about like it could apply to internal stakeholders within corporations and then the CEOs negotiating with the government, right? Like, it's I think the first step in applying them to debates is to apply them to situations in real life and then see where that journey takes you. And then it becomes much easier to apply them to debate. Yeah, I think there's often like an in-between step that people are missing, which is to take anything that they're absorbing for the sake of debate and then applying it directly to debate. Whereas like my feeling is it should be reading things because it's good to read things and finding out about things because it's interesting, and then applying them to the real world. And then the real world often influences a lot of like debate motions in my mind. That would be like my response. What two-level games? Could you give us a little info on how it works when domestic opposition isn't quite evenly matched, or coalition politics with disparate ideologies? I mean, I can just tell you whether it would go up and down. So like, if the opposition is weak, then you have a bigger negotiation set, obviously, because you have less options that you have to take off the table. And if it's a coalition with disparate ideologies, probably the negotiation set goes down as opposed to up, because, if it's like the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives who have like somewhat different opinions on foreign policy, like the coalition that existed in the UK 8 years ago, like, then your negotiation set probably goes down. So with the weaker opposition, it probably stays the same because you don't have to remove options. And with coalition politics, with like people who have different kinds of political opinions, probably go down. And then the question is, would it be possible to have the link of the Google Docs here? Vanessa, I would just like to get like the sharing permission sorted, if that's fine, and then I can get that done. Like I will just send the document to the organizer, I promise, and they will share it with you if that's okay. I will do that like in the next couple of minutes. But yeah, like I hope this was helpful. I think like sessions which are kind of like open-ended and go through lots of IR stuff are usually interesting, and I hope you guys got something out of this. And I really want to cover South Asia, Pratham, but I think we have spent so long on IR. I've been told that we had like 5 more minutes and we're kind of done. I wanted to like do South Asia and then like do IR, take a couple of questions and then do South Asia. But then we just spent like 40 minutes just going through a lot of questions that you guys have. I will say this, I do have some stuff on South Asia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to appendage this document with some of my thoughts on how to do debates on South Asia. So when you guys get this document, it will have some of that detail. I'm sorry we couldn't cover it within the lecture content. Unfortunately, we had like a very limited amount of time and we can't do this for like 2 hours or something. But yeah, like this just something to keep in mind, like you'll get something. In terms of where will this document be posted, who gives it to you, like I think you should ask the ORCOM, but I will make sure that the ORCOM has the document from me at least in the next few minutes. Yeah, like I hope this was helpful, guys. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for all of your questions. They were really interesting. I'm really happy that we got to cover like really like diverse range of situations. Yeah, like good luck for the tournament, and I hope you have a great time. And as always, like if you have any personal questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk in person. Yeah. Good luck and see you all soon.